it's Eason, and welcome to Metal Monday, where I talk about albums that I recommend you listen to so you can start your week off right. Now, I'm not exactly a current type of guy. I don't usually consider release date to have any kind of importance. In my opinion, if it's good, it's good. As a result of this, though, I end up listening to a lot of current albums, a lot of in the now type albums, and also a lot of albums that came out in the past. This week, I'll be talking about an album that actually came out this year and ended up as a very strong contender for all the best of lists at the... I just realized that I've been covering a lot of contenders for the best of lists of 2020. I guess I only bring you choice then, don't I? Said album is the third full length of a Norwegian three-piece, the name of which I had to look up online, and I'm still not 100% on the pronunciation, so if I fuck that up, sorry guys. Honest mistake. The album that I am talking about is Vredehammer's Viperous. Vredehammer was initially born as a solo project for the main songwriter, vocalist, bass player, etc. Per Valle, who recruited other members to help him do what he wanted to do, and it evolved into a band. Per Valle isn't only the progenitor of this project, he's also the only stable member throughout the years. In fact, the lineup for Viperous is entirely different, with the exception of Per Valle, from the 2016 opus of the band, Violator. Now, real talk, I haven't really been a fan of the band. In fact, I only noticed them with Viperous, so I'm not really that well-versed in what they have done in the past, as a result of which I'm only going to be judging this album on its own merits, of which there are many. Now, brass tacks. The music that is featured on Viperous is a rather tech and thrash-influenced death metal married to black metal. I know, as always, this is a bit abstract. What is waiting for you here is the marriage of high-tech chugs of tech death married to thrashy and at times black-influenced riffs, blast beats, and double bass attacks galore, coupled with guttural vocals throughout. Of course, then the question becomes, how is this different from any other Black Death band with technical leanings that is shredding the scene out there, which is the presence of electronic/industrial elements. That said, when I say the presence of industrial elements, I don't mean that Vredehammer is actually playing their hand at being the first industrial black and death metal band, which they wouldn't be because there are bands like that. What I mean is a very slight and often secondary presence of industrial elements, notably synthesizers, that tend to creep in throughout their songs. Despite the fact that this album actually opens on a very fast synth arpeggio, you're not going to be hearing a lot of synthesizer work throughout. In fact, right then and there, it is possible to identify a trend and or a pattern that is present throughout this album. In most arrangements, synthesizer elements come through during bridge sections, usually after the midpoints of songs, after which they are blended into the metal elements and serve as background embellishments. The arrangements of songs such as Suffocate All Light, Skinwalker, or Wounds pretty much follow the same pattern. In fact, more or less the same pattern is present throughout the tracklist. Now, I know that this sounds like a negative thing in that it looks like I am claiming that this album is formulaic in and of itself, but hear me out on how that is not exactly a negative. You see, the one thing that Vredehammer absolutely excel at, which is what makes this album such a fucking joy to listen to, is structuring and playing incredibly catchy, incredibly memorable, and incredibly tasty tech-adjacent, thrash-influenced, hard-hitting riffs. Special shout out goes to Aggressor for having the best death thrash tinted, most memorable riff on this goddamn album. The riff structures present throughout Viperous seems to split the difference between tech death, black, and thrash, but has an undeniable tech death foundation, in that most riffs are structured around really rapid, really fast, and really tech death type chugs that sort of veer into black or thrash territories. That said, the bombastic showboating and the ego-stroking guitar wankery that sometimes mars tech death albums for me is entirely absent from Viperous, and it seems to have been switched with laser-guided focus instead. In fact, Viperous is impressively lean in terms of its content. The motto of the band going into this album seems to be to keep everything as tight and as contained as possible. As a result of this, no track exceeds the standard track length. At 9 tracks and 42 minutes, Viperous is extremely tight, where not a single moment seems wasted or superfluous or anything like that. From the way that they write their riffs to the song structures to how the transitions are done in the songs, everything is extremely lean without a single ounce of fat. The one trap that the band never falls into is overwriting their shit in an attempt to keep it tight. In fact, I would say that far as the technicality goes, the band writes everything just enough. Instead of taking you out on a mindfuck riff journey where notes and chords scatter all around and go to unexpected places before actually forming patterns that you can discern, Vredehammer opts to bludgeon you to the ground with extremely tight, extremely contained, and razor-sharp riffs that always maintain a certain amount of tension instead of dispersing it. This is also aided by the fact that most of the drumming that you're going to be hearing on this album is going to be either blast beats or laid on top of sustained double bass attacks, where the only embellishment for the most part seems to lie in the cymbal work. Apropos, the element of variety within Viperous does not depend on rather sharp genre shifts or disparate elements being brought together and glued into a whole. It is rather the amount in which the elements that are present from the start are utilized throughout the song. For example, the second track, Suffocate All Light, is more or less the Viperous brand, the Vredehammer brand of Black and Death savagery until it hits the bridge, wherein it introduces synthesizers which remain in the song until the song ends. However, as if bridging this, the third track, the titular track, Viperous, opens with synthesizer atmospherics which remain present throughout the song. Furthermore, when it hits the bridge, Viperous seems to tread almost deathcore-like grounds. And then there is the track In Shadow, which opens with a very playful, very fun little mid-paced riff before going back to the hard and fast, furious stylings of Vredehammer. The follow-up track to In Shadow, Wounds, actually comes together in a more overtly black metal fashion than ever before. It's not that you don't hear flourishes of black metal throughout the length of Viperous until Wounds, but the black metal elements just become all that more overt during the conclusion of this track, where the band unabashedly veers in that direction. And after Wounds is where Viperous veers about this close to getting boring with the track Any Place But Home. Under normal circumstances, when albums are front-loaded and or they feature points in which tracks seem to blur together because they don't really pull anything different than what you have heard before, this counts as a negative. This is either because the tracks are too similar to the ones that came before, or because they are not distinguished from each other well enough so that they become this amorphous blob of songs. Vredehammer managed to avoid this. Any Place But Home might have ended up the stumbling point of this album, the Achilles heel, if you will, but it manages to avoid this by perfectly integrating punk influences into its riff structures. And there we arrive at the only complaint that I have about this album, which is the final track, From a Spark to a Withering Flame. The reason why I don't really like this track within the context of this album is because while the rest of the album is upper tempo, this one is mid-paced. While the rest of it rely on solid, extremely tight and tense riffing, this one plays up the groovier aspects of death metal. I'm no stranger to final tracks being entirely different than whatever has preceded them, believe you me. But in this instance, this track is so vastly different that it makes you wonder if the rest of the album could not have been elevated to a much much higher level if this type of overt variety had been introduced throughout. From a Spark to a Withering Flame not only slows things down and plays up the groovier aspects of death metal, it also features synthesizers in a much more prominent manner than the rest of the album. Synthesizer touches here on this track are used to punctuate and emphasize the pulse of the song, which results in an incredibly nice mood. Therein, I kind of end up in a dilemma because I can easily separate the final track from the rest of the track list and still have an incredibly cohesive album. But when I try to place From a Spark to a Withering Flame at any other point during the track list, it breaks the flow of the album. So the only place where it could have ended up in is the final track. But as a final track, it doesn't really feel like the album closer for me. It doesn't leave me with the longing and the question of when I'm going to be hearing more from this band again. It is a nice enough song to finish an album, but considering that the rest of the album just keeps going with a certain amount of tension, this sudden shift into chill mode really doesn't work. Though, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that is a minor gripe on my part. I just want my album flows to be perfect is all. So far so good, but the one aspect that I haven't talked about is the production, which is on point. Don't get me wrong, Vredehammer does not have the most dynamic or the most expensive production that I have ever heard. That award goes to Horrendous. However, Viperous is produced well enough to reflect the music contained within it. The drums hit hard and fast, the guitars are loud and prominent, you can hear the synthesizer cutting through the mix, and the bass is audible, the vocals sit comfortably, and overall it is not bricked too much. It is not polished as some of the more blatantly tech death albums that you will hear. It lacks that glossy veneer that you usually hear in their production, but I think this owes more to the fact that it is not really tech death that they are playing. But satisfied? Definitely. So overall, if you are a tech death fan, this might leave you a little high and dry. If you like your black thrash or black thrash a lot more straightforward, you will not find much to like here. That said, if you like the more technical side of death metal, but not tech death per se, if you like your death trash to have a lot of excitement, if you are fond of blackened death, you are definitely going to like this album. I mean, well written, well played, well produced, extremely enjoyable, tight in times of time, no fat. What more do you want? There's a Bandcamp link in the description. Click that and go listen to it and then tell me what you think, because I, for one, really dig this album and can't wait to see what this band does next. Until next time, hope you have a great week. It's Sin. Peace out.